Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 50. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him. For no one who does a deed of power in my name will be soon afterward able to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose the reward. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who trusts in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and go to Gehenna, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the reign of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into Gehenna, where the worm never dies and the fire is never extinguished. For everyone will be salted in fire. Salt is good. But if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. Power, force, coercion, these are the tools that we tend to look at as either shortcuts or the only possible means to the end, to an end which seems out of reach. If we could just exert more control, we could make others bow to our understanding of how the world should operate. We are not necessarily looking for an evil result. We're looking to accomplish good. We'd even like that good to coincide with God's will, with bringing about God's reign on earth as a fully implemented reality. If I could force everyone to love each other, we would finally live in peace and harmony. What could possibly be wrong with that? We've heard the ends don't justify the means, but then again, we have seen example after example of good people using questionable means to achieve results with which we have or might have agreed. I've never been so focused on following the rules that I might not be willing to bend a few of them to accomplish something the rules simply don't allow for. Perhaps a rule is unjust. Perhaps it's just been poorly considered, worded, thought out. Perhaps it's just my hubris in thinking that I know better. Perhaps it's my being too lazy or too impatient to work through all the, quote, appropriate channels to get something done. A refrain I grew up with in Brazil was, there was always a jeitinho brasileiro. There was always a workaround to do what was needed despite rules, despite laws, despite established procedures or expectations. It might be a bribe. It might be looking the other way. It might be bending an interpretation of law or procedure. It might be getting past a middleman, perhaps clearing a few hoops to facilitate something. It rather much went along with another saying, to the king's friends, the law's favors. To the king's enemies, the law's rigors. We called it the way things are done. Whether or not it was how things should be done. Society simply accepted the benefits it could collect, looking on rules as more of a system established to make life difficult for the king's enemies. Perhaps the biggest issue underlying all this concept and this practice was how it was applied so unevenly. It didn't fit everybody the same way. If you had the right friends, the right connections, or just caught somebody with a little bit of power on a good day, life was a lot easier, and red tape just seemed to disappear. On the other hand, most of those in a position of a little power relished wielding that power to make themselves feel superior to the many, many people coming before them. Every action was a power play. For beneath all the rules was this notion of one's relative worth defined by the power that one held, that one wielded. That's the issues the disciples had brought to Jesus in last Sunday's passage, if you'll remember. It's still the same issue they bring up in today's passage. They're phrasing it differently here, but it amounts to the very same thing. Rather than speaking of who is greatest in God's reign, here they're addressing how to keep some people out in order to protect their own standing. As much as they wanted to become the doorkeepers of God's reign, Jesus denies them that position. Rather, he tells them that doorkeeping does not mesh with the principles of God's reign at all. Rather than working for the purity of those allowed to be on the inside of God's reign, their very participation in God's reign was at stake in their attempt to keep out those they did not know or considered undesirable. There was no need for them to worry about losing rewards for faithful service to God, Jesus says. The ones who were in jeopardy of losing anything would be the very ones attempting to protect their position by playing doorkeeper. The means they were using for self-preservation was actually leading to the opposite result. The means was not justifying the end. It was denying them the very aim and purpose of God's reign. if those whose action of mercy is simply to share a cup of water to meet another's need in service to Christ will surely be rewarded, well, then the disciples had no need to worry about someone else taking away a benefit they had accrued. The blessings of God's reign are not so meager as to be insufficient to meet the needs of all. God's reign is established on a principle of bounty, of abundance. Their attempt to wield power and control as gatekeepers was built on the premise of scarcity. They were afraid that there was not enough benefit and blessing in God's reign to apply liberally to everyone. God's reign is not built on a foundation of scarcity. It's not wrapped in some insufficiency to meet the needs of everyone. It's not based on dividing up some fixed quantity of blessing. As the saying goes, it's not pie. God's economy is based on the principle of abundance. The inherent fertility of the earth does not simply apply to the fire ants who seem to multiply around us, the gray squirrels in our oak trees, or the bumper crops of weeds I seem to cultivate every time I try to plant a garden. It also applies to the breadth, grace, and welcome and embrace of God's reign. There's enough of God's love to go around. Love does not run out because we give it away with too much abandon. Love grows, increases, expands, and multiplies as we give it away. The more we give, the more we have to give. The more natural it is to give. And ultimately, the more we receive in return. It's self-propagating. Just as the whole of God's reign. Christian nationalism tries to say that only those people just like us belong. We are the only ones who have inherent rights. If you would become just like us, well, then you might be able to participate. But we are the ones who get to determine whether or not you meet our standard. We are keepers of the gate. We decide if you do or do not belong. That's pretty much what the disciples were trying to do. They were trying to place limits around who had the right to use Jesus' name and authority for any action whatsoever. They wanted power. They wanted control. Maybe they could not determine who would be first or second in God's reign. But they could thin the ranks to make sure they at least got good seating. Mark places this discussion as the context for Jesus' comments about casting oneself into the sea attached to a millstone. The stumbling block he mentions is that hindering another from following Jesus. It's culling the ranks in God's reign. It's playing the role of gatekeeper. Jesus then refers to Gehenna, Jerusalem's waste dump. Those who take on the role of gatekeeper put themselves in the same category of all the other refuse dumped outside of town. This is not what we have come to call hell. It's the landfill. It's the dump. It's the place where everything worthless is discarded, eventually to be consumed by worms or burning methane. I'm reminded of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount where he says that we will be judged according to the very same means or measure that we use to judge others. Our attempts to exclude others don't exclude them. They just result in our self-exclusion. When we fail to love, to include, embrace, and welcome others into God's reign alongside us, we are the ones who lose out. We lose the blessings of God's reign akin to cutting off our own hands or feet. The greed with which we cling to blessings, position, power, or control removes us from the very things we are trying to cling to grasp onto. Christian nationalism focuses on controlling who is in and who is out. It insists on being the gatekeepers, only allowing those like ourselves to participate. Love and grace work the opposite way. They give of themselves generously, freely. And in the giving, they are multiplied beyond all of our expectations. We either embrace God's reign on God's terms, or we exclude ourselves from it. The only means to God's reign are love and grace, not force, not power, not control. Which means will we embrace?